I invite you to hear the story of the moment someone in my own family tried to steal our inheritance, and just 15 minutes later got hit with the hardest slap of reality imaginable. If you think greed can win against everything, stay until the end, because what happens next will send chills down your spine. My name is Kelsey Turner, and I am 28 years old. The suffocating tension filling our large living room in Missoula was violently shattered when my sister slammed a thick legal folder onto the cold marble table with a look of absolute triumph. She stood before our terrified relatives wearing an arrogant smirk and loudly announced that this house and every company asset now belonged entirely to her because our father was gone. She pointed straight at me, sneering as she said, "Pack your things and get out. From now on, you have no rights in this house." Then she twisted the knife even deeper and added, "Dad is dead, and I'm the only one who gets to decide everyone's fate." She insisted that because our father had been missing long enough to be presumed dead, she was the only legitimate heir with the power to control our future. Her cruelty reached its peak when she turned toward me with pure disgust and ordered me to leave, immediately refusing to let me stay even one more minute in what she called her property. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry or beg. Instead, I calmly pulled my phone from my pocket, holding her gaze without flinching. I dialed a specific number I had saved and spoke into the phone in a voice loud enough to silence the entire room. "Dad, you should come here right now. Someone just declared you dead. If you want to witness the ending where greed finally gets punished, hit subscribe and stay until the very last second, because you won't want to miss the moment she completely falls apart." 2 weeks before that chaotic meeting in our living room, my life in Missoula had not yet been swallowed by this fake atmosphere of grief. Our family dynamic had been fractured long before the accident because my mother passed away when I was still in high school, leaving my father and me to navigate the world alone. We poured our collective grief into hard work to build Turner Construction from a small local operation into the most respected firm in the state through sheer determination and countless sleepless nights. I spent my weekends on dusty construction sites, learning the business from the ground up because I wanted to understand every aspect of the legacy we were building. My sister Shelby never shared that drive because she believed her birthright as the eldest entitled her to luxury without the sweat. She constantly accused Dad of favoring me simply because I chose to wear a hard hat and visit muddy job sites while she spent her days shopping online for expensive designer clothes and vacationing with friends. Her jealousy was a slow poison that she nursed for years until it finally began to consume her entirely. I always tried to ignore her snide comments about my work clothes or my lack of social life because I wanted to keep the peace for Dad's sake. The fragile peace in our household finally shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when Dad found a stack of urgent notices hidden deep in the back of the mailbox. These were not standard utility bills, but aggressive demand letters from dangerous loan sharks regarding unpaid gambling debts that had spiraled out of control. I watched the color drain from my father's face as he realized the extent of the financial mess Shelby had created behind our backs. She had gambled away a small fortune on high-stakes poker online and expected the family business to quietly cover her massive losses like we always did in the past. But what made his hands shake with uncontrollable rage was the discovery that she had forged his signature to secure a second high-interest mortgage on a commercial property we owned. This was no longer just a simple mistake or a cry for attention, because she had committed a serious crime that could jeopardize the entire future of the company we had worked so hard to build. Dad called her into his study immediately, and the sound of his disappointment was worse than any anger I had ever heard. A screaming match erupted behind the closed doors of his study that shook the very walls of our home. I stood in the hallway listening to Dad's voice crack with a mixture of heartbreak and fury as he confronted her about the betrayal and the criminal forgery. He shouted clearly enough for me to hear that he would remove her from his will permanently if she did not attend rehab and start working to pay him back every single cent. He told her that he could no longer trust her with the family money if she was willing to steal from her own blood to feed her addiction. Shelby stormed out of the room moments later with a face twisted in ugly rage and tears that looked more like frustration than genuine sorrow. She stopped when she saw me standing there and shot a glare of such pure hatred back at our father's door that it made my blood run cold. I asked her what she was going to do, but she just shouldered past me without saying a word and locked herself in her bedroom. The atmosphere in the house remained tense for several days until Shelby suddenly adopted a completely different demeanor over breakfast one morning. She acted humble and tearful while apologizing profusely for her mistakes, and promising Dad that she was ready to turn her life around for the better. She poured him coffee with a steady hand and claimed that the argument had been a wake-up call that she desperately needed. She knew Dad was planning a trip to inspect a potential development site along the dangerous curves of the Clark Fork River. Shelby insisted on accompanying him on this specific trip because she claimed she wanted to use the long drive to mend their broken relationship and prove her commitment to change. Dad was skeptical at first, but his soft heart eventually gave in to his daughter's pleading because he desperately wanted to believe she could be the daughter he remembered. I warned him to be careful because her sudden change in attitude felt too convenient to be true, but he dismissed my concerns as unnecessary worry. I stood by the window watching their car disappear down the long driveway, while a heavy feeling settled in my gut that I tried to dismiss as paranoia. The house felt unusually empty that night, as I tried to focus on reviewing blueprints for a new client to keep my mind off their trip. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by the aggressive pounding on the front door just past 2 a.m. I rushed downstairs with my heart hammering against my ribs to find flashing red and blue lights illuminating our driveway through the front window. The local sheriff stood on the porch, with his hat in his hands and a grim expression that told me everything before he even spoke. He stepped inside and informed me in a low voice that my father's vehicle had missed a turn on the cliff road and plunged into the darkest part of the rushing river. 1 week passed since that fateful night, and my hope continued to fade with the rushing current of the Clark Fork River. The search and rescue operation had turned into a grueling recovery mission that seemed to drag on for an eternity, while I stood by the muddy banks praying for a miracle that never came. The heavy industrial crane finally groaned under the weight of the wreckage as it pulled my father's sedan from the dark water, and the sight of the twisted metal made my stomach churn with nausea. The windshield was completely shattered, and the interior was filled with river mud, but the terrifying realization was that the driver's seat was completely empty. The local authorities somberly removed their hats and informed me that the force of the current likely swept his body miles downstream, which meant the chances of finding him alive were now non-existent. I stood there staring at the dripping wreckage while a cold numbness spread through my chest because the finality of their words felt like a physical blow. Shelby performed the role of the grieving daughter with terrifying precision as she wailed loudly enough for the news cameras to capture her sorrow. She threw herself against the hood of the police cruiser and sobbed about how much she missed her daddy while the deputies looked at her with sympathy. However, her performance crumbled the moment the cameras turned away, and she thought no one was watching her closely. I walked past her near the edge of the police cordon and overheard her speaking into her cell phone with a voice that was chillingly calm and devoid of any earlier emotion. She covered her mouth with her hand and whispered into the receiver with a tone of impatient arrogance that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry about the deadline because the old man is dead and I'm about to get the money to pay you back." I froze in my tracks, but she had already hung up and returned to her act before I could confront her about the disgusting conversation I had just witnessed. I decided to channel my anger into finding answers because something about the accident scene simply did not add up to me. I walked over to the edge of the cliff where the car had gone over and crouched down to examine the tire tracks left in the soft earth. The tracks cut a straight and determined line through the grass leading directly to the drop-off without any deviation or hesitation. There were absolutely no skid marks or signs of torn earth that would indicate frantic braking or a desperate attempt to regain control of the vehicle. It looked as though the car had been guided over the edge with deliberate precision rather than careening off during a high-speed loss of control. My suspicion only deepened over the next few days as Shelby began an aggressive campaign to take control of the company before the search was even officially called off. She dragged our family lawyer, Mr. Thornton, to the house and demanded that he expedite the legal process to declare Dad deceased so she could access the accounts. I sat across from them in the living room and watched as she tapped her manicured nails impatiently on the table while Mr. Thornton tried to explain the mandatory waiting period for missing persons cases. Shelby slammed her hand down and shouted at the elderly lawyer with zero respect for the situation or his long service to our family. I don't care about your technicalities because my father is clearly gone, and I need access to those funds immediately to manage the estate. Shelby yelled with a face twisted in greed. I could not stay silent any longer and looked at her with disgust. We haven't even found him yet, and all you can think about is selling off the company he built. Shelby turned on me with a sneer and laughed cruelly. Stop being delusional, Kelsey, because he is never coming back, and I am not going to let this business sink just because you want to play detective. I stormed out of the room to escape her toxicity and retreated to the study where I tried to compose myself amidst the piles of search maps. The phone on the desk rang suddenly, and the shrill sound made me jump because we had been receiving condolences all morning. I picked up the receiver, expecting another sympathy call, but the voice on the other end was rough and urgent. The man introduced himself as a ranger named Travis who was calling from a station 20 miles downstream because he had found something that changed everything. Early the next morning, I drove frantically through the dense pine forests to reach the meeting location that the ranger had described over the phone. The winding mountain roads were treacherous and slick with morning dew, but I pushed the engine to its limit because the possibility that my father was alive made every second feel like an eternity. The ranger station was located deep within the National Forest territory where the trees grew so thick that they blocked out most of the morning sunlight. I pulled my car up to the small wooden cabin and saw a tall man in a uniform waiting on the porch with a serious expression that told me this was not a prank. Travis stepped forward to meet me and didn't waste any time with pleasantries as he gestured for me to follow him inside the quiet building. He led me down a narrow hallway to a room at the back that had been converted into a makeshift infirmary with medical supplies stacked neatly on metal shelves. I stopped in the doorway and felt the air leave my lungs because the sight in front of me was something I had been afraid to hope for. A man was lying on a simple cot with his leg elevated in a splint and thick bandages wrapping around his head and chest. The bruises on his face were dark and purple, but there was no mistaking the familiar features that I had spent my entire life looking up to. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a moment as I walked slowly toward the bed, because seeing him broken like this was both a relief and a nightmare. He was breathing steadily, but his face was pale and drawn with exhaustion from whatever ordeal he had survived in that freezing river. I reached out and gently touched his hand, because I needed to feel the warmth of his skin to confirm that this wasn't just a cruel hallucination brought on by my grief. His eyelids fluttered open a few moments later, and I leaned in close with tears streaming down my face, ready to welcome him back. But the moment his eyes focused on my face, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. There was no recognition in his gaze, only a raw and primal terror that I had never seen in my strong and confident father before. He scrambled backward against the headboard of the cot and pulled his arm away from my grasp as if my touch burned him. The look of absolute panic in his eyes broke my heart more than seeing his physical injuries, because he looked at me like I was a stranger who had come to harm him. I tried to keep my voice steady as I leaned forward again to reassure him. Dad, it's me, Kelsey. Don't you recognize me? He pressed his back against the wall and shook his head violently while his breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked around the room frantically, as if searching for an escape route before fixing his terrified eyes on me again. I don't know you. Please don't hurt me. The sound of his trembling voice begging for mercy shattered me because it confirmed that the trauma had taken something vital from him. Travis stepped in gently to check his vitals and signaled for me to give him some space so he could calm down. He walked me to the corner of the room and explained in a hushed tone that he had found my father washed up on a remote sandbar 2 days ago in a state of severe hypothermia. He explained that the severe head trauma Dad sustained during the crash had caused significant retrograde amnesia, which meant he had lost his personal identity and memories of the immediate past. Travis told me that while his physical wounds were healing well, his mind had blocked out the trauma as a defense mechanism against the horror he had experienced. I looked back at my father, who was now curling into a ball on the bed, and realized that his fear wasn't just confusion, but a survival instinct. He was terrified because somewhere deep in his subconscious he knew that someone had tried to kill him. If I took him to a public hospital or announced that he was alive, Shelby would know immediately that her plan had failed. I knew my sister well enough to realize that if she found out he survived, she would not hesitate to finish what she started to protect her inheritance and stay out of prison. The thought of exposing him to that danger while he was so vulnerable was impossible for me to accept. I turned to Travis and took a deep breath before making the most difficult decision of my life. I told him that we could not report this to the police yet, because the person who did this to him was still out there and would come back to finish the job. I explained that my father needed time to heal in secret where he was safe from the people who wanted him dead. Travis looked at me for a long moment before nodding his head in agreement because he understood the gravity of the situation. We agreed that I would bring supplies and medicine while he continued to monitor Dad's recovery in the safety of this isolated cabin. I looked at my father one last time and promised silently that I would protect him until he was strong enough to remember the truth and reclaim the life that was stolen from him. 3 days hiding in the deep forest passed with every moment feeling heavy as lead, while the outside world continued to believe that my father was gone forever. The isolation of the ranger station created a strange sense of timelessness, where our only focus was the slow and painful recovery of the man lying in the small infirmary room. Travis proved to be an invaluable ally during those long hours, because he tended to my father's physical wounds with the skill of a field medic and the patience of a saint. We established a quiet routine where I would bring fresh supplies and food from town under the cover of darkness, while Travis monitored Dad's vitals and ensured he remained hidden from any curious hikers. My father's physical strength began to return slowly as the color came back to his cheeks, and he was finally able to sit up in bed without dizziness. However, his mind remained trapped behind a thick and impenetrable fog that refused to lift no matter how much I tried to reach him. I spent hours sitting by his bedside telling him detailed stories about our family vacations and the skyscrapers we built together in hopes that a familiar name or place would spark a light in his eyes. He listened to me with a polite curiosity that was heartbreaking because he looked at me like I was a kindly stranger rather than his beloved daughter. The turning point finally arrived on the 4th afternoon when I decided to show him the personal effects that Travis had recovered from his pockets on the riverbank. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch that contained the antique silver pocket watch he had carried every day for 30 years. The glass face was shattered from the impact of the crash, and the hands were frozen at the exact moment the water had stopped the mechanism. I placed the cold metal object gently into his rough hands and watched his reaction closely while holding my breath in anticipation. He looked down at the watch with a blank expression at first, but then his fingers began to trace the familiar engraving on the back cover. Suddenly, he dropped the watch onto the blanket and grabbed his head with both hands as a groan of agonizing pain escaped his lips. The object had acted as a lightning rod that pierced through the mental block and triggered a violent flood of suppressed memories. His body convulsed on the bed as the images of that terrifying night rushed back into his mind like a high-speed film reel that he could no longer pause. I rushed forward to hold his shoulders while Travis quickly moved to check his pulse because we were terrified he was having a seizure. But it was not a medical emergency because my father looked up at me a moment later, and the emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a look of devastating clarity and profound sorrow. The confusion was gone, but it was replaced by a horror so deep that it made him look 10 years older in a matter of seconds. He gripped my arm tightly, and tears began to stream down his weathered face as he pieced together the final moments before he went into the water. He told us with a shaking voice that he had pulled the car over near the steep embankment to rest his eyes because he felt unusually drowsy during the drive. He remembered hearing the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside, but he assumed it was just an animal passing by the vehicle. Then he felt the car lurch forward as the handbrake was disengaged and the vehicle began to roll toward the dark abyss of the river. He struggled to open the door, but the angle was too steep, and the momentum was already dragging him down into the freezing depths. Dad looked at me with eyes full of betrayal and whispered the words that froze the very air in the small room. When the car plunged into the water, I saw her. Shelby stood on the bank coldly turning her back even though I banged on the door for help. The confession hung in the air like a poisonous cloud because hearing it out loud made the reality of her evil undeniable. My sister had not just caused an accident or made a mistake because she had looked her own father in the eye and chosen to let him die so she could take his money. Travis looked at the floor with a grim expression, while I felt a wave of nausea wash over me at the sheer cruelty of her actions. I wanted to call the police immediately to have her arrested for attempted murder, but my father shook his head slowly. Despite the immense pain of knowing his own child had tried to end his life, he insisted that we stick to the plan I had mentioned earlier. He said that a simple arrest was not enough, because she would use his money to hire lawyers and lie her way out of it like she always did. He wanted to look her in the eye and destroy her lies in front of everyone she was trying to impress. We agreed that he would remain dead for 2 more days until the memorial service and inheritance meeting where we would give Shelby the surprise of her life. That weekend, the real storm was not raging outside in the Montana wilderness, but was waiting to explode right inside my living room. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating as relatives and business partners began to arrive for the reading of the will, which Shelby had organized with suspicious haste. She had transformed the grieving household into a stage for her grand coronation, and she was dressed for the part in a tailored black designer dress that cost more than most people earned in a month. She moved through the crowd of murmuring guests with the grace of a queen and accepted their condolences with a practiced nod, while her eyes scanned the room to ensure everyone important was present to witness her victory. I stood in the corner watching her performance with a burning knot of anger in my stomach because I knew that beneath the pearls and the somber expression, she was practically vibrating with excitement at the thought of finally getting her hands on the money. Mr. Thornton arrived precisely at noon, carrying his battered leather briefcase and looking visibly uncomfortable with the proceedings. He sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table and arranged his papers with slow, deliberate movements because he clearly did not want to be there. He cleared his throat to silence the room and began to read the standard preamble of the last will and testament that my father had drafted years ago. However, he had barely gotten through the first paragraph when Shelby cleared her throat loudly and held up a hand to stop him. She stood up from her chair and looked down at the elderly lawyer with a mixture of pity and condescension, as if he were a senile old man who had forgotten how the world worked. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp document that looked suspiciously new compared to the yellowed pages Mr. Thornton was holding. She smoothed the paper out on the table and looked around the room to ensure she had the undivided attention of every single person present. "You can put that old thing away because it is no longer valid," Shelby announced with a voice that dripped with arrogance. "Dad signed a transfer paper giving all absolute rights to the company and the estate to me, just hours before his accident to settle my debts." The room erupted into a chaos of whispered conversations and shocked gasps as the guests tried to process this bombshell. Mr. Thornton looked at the document with narrowed eyes and pointed out that the signature looked shaky, but Shelby quickly countered that Dad was under immense stress about her safety. She spun a convincing lie that Dad had transferred everything to her name to protect the assets from the loan sharks she had been involved with. It was a masterclass in manipulation because she used the very real debt she had created as the justification for why she now owned everything. She painted herself not as the cause of the problem, but as the savior who had stepped up to burden the responsibility of the family fortune. Then she turned her attention to me, and the mask of the grieving daughter slipped completely to reveal the cruel bully underneath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope, which she tossed carelessly onto the floor at my feet, like she was throwing scraps to a stray dog. The envelope landed with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Shelby smirked at me and gestured to the floor with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I'll give you a small amount which is enough to rent a cheap apartment for a few months, so take it and get out, because you are an eyesore to me." My blood boiled at the sheer audacity of her lie and the public humiliation she was trying to inflict on me. I stood up slowly and ignored the envelope on the floor while staring directly into her cold eyes. I told her that she was a liar and a thief who would never get away with stealing what Dad and I had built. Shelby lost her temper instantly and slammed her hand down on the marble table, which created the thunderous noise that had started this entire confrontation. She opened her mouth to scream at me to get out of her house, but the words died in her throat. The heavy double doors at the entrance of the living room swung open with a slow and deliberate creak that drew everyone's eyes towards the hallway. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying as a figure emerged from the shadows. Travis walked in first, wearing his ranger uniform and pushing a wheelchair with steady determination. Seated in that chair was the man Shelby had just declared dead. My father sat upright with bandages still wrapped around his head and leg, but his eyes were wide open and burning with a fierce intensity that I had not seen in weeks. He did not look at the guests or the lawyer because his gaze was locked entirely on the daughter who had left him to die in the freezing river. The sudden appearance of my father acted like a bolt of lightning that struck the very center of the room and froze time itself for everyone present. The atmosphere shifted instantly from uncomfortable tension to a state of absolute shock as 20 pairs of eyes locked onto the man who was supposed to be dead. Shelby let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the vaulted ceilings as the color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue of terror. Her hand went limp from the shock, causing the crystal wine glass she was holding to slip from her fingers and crash onto the hardwood floor, where it shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. She stumbled backward until her legs hit the edge of the dining table, and she looked as though she might collapse at any moment because her mind could not process the reality standing before her. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no words came out, only a strangled gasping sound, as if she were looking at a vengeful ghost that had crawled out of the river to drag her down to hell. My father sat rigidly in his wheelchair with a posture that commanded respect, despite the bandages that still wrapped his head and the cast on his leg. He did not say a word at first, but simply wheeled himself slowly into the center of the room until he was just a few feet away from where Shelby was cowering. The silence in the room was so profound that I could hear the ragged sound of Shelby's breathing as she pressed her hands against her chest in a futile attempt to calm her racing heart. Dad looked up at her with eyes that held no trace of the fatherly affection he had once given her so freely, but instead burned with the cold, hard light of judgment. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out the crumpled transfer document she had just presented to the lawyer. He threw the paper onto her lap with a look of utter disgust and spoke with a voice that, while raspy from his injuries, carried enough authority to shake the foundation of the house. "You dare to stand there and claim I signed this paper giving you everything. At that exact moment, I was struggling to breathe in freezing water because you released the brake and pushed my car over the edge." A collective gasp went through the room as the relatives and business partners turned to look at Shelby with expressions of dawning horror. Shelby seemed to snap out of her paralyzed state as the weight of the accusation hit her, and she immediately went into survival mode. She began to shake her head violently and looked around the room at the guests with desperate eyes, pleading with them to ignore the man in the wheelchair. She pointed a trembling finger at Dad and tried to laugh, but the sound came out as a hysterical choke that fooled absolutely no one. "Don't listen to him because he is clearly confused and suffering from severe brain damage," Shelby shrieked, her voice rising an octave with panic. "The accident scrambled his memories and he doesn't know what he is saying. Kelsey must be manipulating him to say these horrible things to steal my inheritance." She tried to regain her composure by smoothing her dress and turning to Mr. Thornton with a fake smile plastered on her face. She insisted that they needed to call a doctor immediately to have Dad sedated because he was clearly delusional and dangerous to himself and others. However, her desperate attempt to gaslight the room and paint herself as the victim was cut short when Travis stepped forward from behind the wheelchair. He held up a small, ruggedized electronic device that looked like a hard drive and plugged it into the large smart TV that was mounted on the living room wall. The screen flickered to life and displayed a series of complex data logs and audio waveforms that were time-stamped with the exact date and time of the accident. Travis pointed to the screen with a steady hand and addressed the room with the calm, factual tone of a law enforcement officer presenting irrefutable evidence. "The vehicle's internal data system confirms that the driver's door was opened and closed from the outside just moments before the car began to roll, and the audio sensors clearly recorded the distinct sound of high heels walking away on the gravel." He pressed a button on the remote, and a grainy but unmistakable audio recording played through the living room speakers. Everyone heard the sound of a car door clicking shut, followed by the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of hard heels walking hurriedly away on the roadside stones, followed seconds later by the terrifying sound of the car groaning as it tipped forward. Shelby froze as the sound of her own footsteps condemned her in front of the entire family. The undeniable proof stripped away her last layer of defense and left her standing there naked in her guilt. Mr. Thornton, who had been waiting for this exact moment, stood up and gave a subtle nod toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. The heavy footsteps of uniformed officers instantly filled the house as police emerged from where they had been waiting silently for the signal. Shelby looked around wildly for an escape route, but realized she was completely trapped by the people she had tried to deceive. Two officers marched straight up to her and pulled her hands roughly behind her back while ignoring her shrieks of protest. The cold, metallic click-click of the handcuffs locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. The relatives who had been afraid of her just moments ago now looked at her with pure revulsion as she was physically restrained. Shelby continued to scream and thrash against the officers, spewing curses at Dad and me, but her reign of terror was officially over. 2 months after the police sirens wailed outside our front door, everything finally returned to its proper order. The silence in the house was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a sense of peace that we had not felt in years. The legal proceedings against Shelby moved with terrifying speed because the evidence against her was simply insurmountable. The jury did not need much time to deliberate after seeing the technical data from the car and hearing my father's heartbreaking testimony about seeing his own child turn her back on him. The judge looked down at her with zero sympathy as he delivered a scathing verdict that sealed her fate for decades to come. She was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder and extensive financial fraud involving the forged property documents. I watched from the gallery as the reality of her situation finally crashed down on her in that cold courtroom. Shelby screamed and cried in absolute despair as the bailiffs led her away because she realized that her greed had cost her the best years of her life. She had traded her freedom and her family for a fortune she never earned, and now she would have nothing but gray concrete walls to look at until she was a middle-aged woman with nothing left. The aftermath of the trial allowed my father to finally focus on the difficult journey of physical and emotional healing. He decided that it was time to step back from the daily grind of the construction business to prioritize his health and find peace in his retirement. He called me into his study one quiet afternoon and placed a stack of documents on the desk that looked very different from the ones Shelby had tried to fake. These were the official transfer papers that handed the reins of Turner Construction over to me completely. He told me with tears in his eyes that he should have done this years ago because I was the one who truly understood the heart of the company. He said he trusted my capability and my moral compass to lead our employees into the future without the shadow of corruption that Shelby had cast over our family. I accepted the responsibility with a promise to honor the legacy he built and to run the business with the integrity that he had always taught me. Our lives also gained a wonderful new addition in the form of Travis, who transitioned from being our savior to becoming a cherished part of our inner circle. The bond between him and my father grew stronger every day as they shared a unique understanding of the trauma they had overcome together in that forest. Travis became a regular guest at our Sunday dinners, where his laughter filled the dining room that used to be dominated by Shelby's complaints and toxic ambition. We would sit around the table enjoying simple meals and talking about the future without any fear of betrayal or hidden agendas. It was a beautiful contrast to the tension of the past and a reminder that true family is built on loyalty and love rather than just blood obligation. Seeing my father smile across the table at the man who saved his life gave me a sense of closure that I desperately needed. This agonizing chapter of our lives served as a profound wake-up call about the destructive power of unchecked avarice. My sister's tragic downfall stands as a stark reminder that material greed can twist a human being into an unrecognizable monster capable of hurting their own flesh and blood. She thought she could bury the truth at the bottom of the Clark Fork River, but she forgot that the truth has a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep you try to sink it. Justice may have been delayed by her lies, but it arrived with the force of a tidal wave to wash away her deception and restore the balance of right and wrong. We learned that while money can build houses, it takes integrity and genuine love to build a home that can withstand the storms of life. I want to thank every single one of you for listening to this emotional